Hello and welcome to a special edition of DSR. I am David Rothkopf. I am joined by our good friend and colleague here at DSR, the Financial Times' Ed Luce, and we have a guest today who we've both known a long time and we have a lot of respect for, the former U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who is now a professor with a very long title, which I'm not going to get into here because it's only a half-hour podcast, at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing okay. I hope you guys are doing well.
Oh, I can't speak for Ed. Ed, are you doing well?
I am doing well.
Good, good. Well, that's a good place to start. You know, as I was sitting here contemplating this conversation this morning, Jake, it dawned on me that you were the National Security Advisor of the United States earlier this year. It seems like you were National Security Advisor 20 years ago. I mean, you don't look it, but it seems like it was 20 years ago. And to me, the shock of the past 10 months in terms of, I'm not talking about personalities. I'm just talking about U.S. policy shifts. Seems dramatic. You feel that way?
Absolutely. Both at home and around the world. I mean, I think what we've seen is just a velocity of activity by this administration. Much of it, in my view, very destructive in terms of dismantling fundamental institutions and guardrails that have really been the foundation of our democracy. And also seeking to call into question and dismantle some of our greatest national assets, whether it's our ability to attract talent, our scientific research base, our alliances. So I think they have done a lot in 10 months, and a lot of it has been about deconstructing, has been about blowing things up more than it's been about constructing.
Yeah, and presumably this is not just the work of 10 months. If you go from one set of policies, whether it's supporting Ukraine to not supporting them so much, or supporting the international trading system to undermining the international trading system, et cetera, it's got to shake the world's understanding of what the U.S. is, and that produces longer-term consequences, no?
One of the things that I've been giving a lot of thought to is how to think about America's capacity to sustain close partnerships and alliances in an era of such unpredictability and such radical swerves in U.S. policy. So when we came in January of 2021, President Biden reached out to our allies and basically said America's back. And our allies kind of looked at the first Trump term and saw something of an aberration and said, you know, we're not going to forget that, but fundamentally we're prepared to proceed on a similar basis to how the U.S. related to its core treaty allies in Europe and Asia over many decades. I think this time around, that's gone out the window. And so the question is, in a world after Trump, how do you build an American foreign policy around the idea that you can have not just permanent interests, but also long-term friendships and alliances that I think are so important to our success and to our security? And I don't have a good answer to that question right now. I think it's something that we should be staring very squarely at because there has been now, I think, such a radical shift in perception, even among America's closest friends.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Ed?
Good to see you, Jake. The Trump, in terms of formulating foreign policy, the Trump administration is about as far as you get from an interagency process. It just doesn't exist. Foreign policy is what Trump says it is, and his principles are often surprised by that because it might have been different to what he said before breakfast. My question to you, is there any upside to that? I mean, we see this process in Gaza this week. The turmoil, the surprise, the Trump initiative just upending everything. Is there any upside on the global stage? Domestic, I know, is very different, to having a president who's got this kind of strange Lavian quality that sort of has people permanently dancing to his tune we might hate, but dancing nevertheless to his tune.
Well, I would say one upside is that it frees him, I think, from a lot of the constraints and shackles in terms of how public opinion, how the commentariat, how not just the right, but the left looks at what he does. It frees him. It allows him to do things that I think other presidents would not have the same latitude to do. And, just as an example on Gaza, you have a lot of the people on the left side of my party sort of saying, this is so great what Trump has done. Why couldn't Biden have done this for a deal that has the IDF occupying literally half of Gaza? And yet, because of the way he operates, he doesn't face, I think, the same constraints that a previous president would have faced. Ukraine is another good example of this, where he can kind of transform the entire bar for what counts as doing something good, such that even selling weapons to Ukraine, not just supplying them, is a huge leap forward. So I do think that it gives him a certain freedom of maneuver, and he is taking advantage of that. Now, specifically on the Gaza thing and what happened over the course of the last couple of weeks, you've got to pair President Trump's unpredictability and willingness to move sharply and quickly with, in this case, Israel's unpredictability, because, of course, a key moment in this was Israeli direct strikes against Qatar, which then set off a chain of events. So in the case of Gaza, there was some combination of American unpredictability or, willingness to lean into an opportunity with the Israelis also willing to lean in their own way. And that, I think, was a factor in how this all came together.
Do you want to follow up, Ed?
Yeah, it's just to sort of drill down a little bit more on this sort of, I mean, it's kind of a superpower, right? The everybody just always talking about it. I mean, we have different ways of measuring the impact of foreign policy, and I've no doubt that all the caveats about this 20-point Gaza peace plan, are very real, and it would be a miracle if we got to stage 4 or 5. I mean, so that notwithstanding, isn't Trump measuring things a very different way? It's not through outcomes. It's through the fact that he is the prime mover and we are all reacting to him. And that is just the permanent kind of Trotskyite revolution going, that is his persona being stamped, his sort of will being stamped on all of our lives in every way. That unpredictability, that uncertainty is by design. That's how Trump operates.
I think that's very well put, but, and it's a very big but, that type of approach, I think, runs into real obstacles when you're dealing with the likes of Putin and Xi, because they also like to put their stamp on things. And, my hope is that we will get there with Ukraine. And I think there is reason to be optimistic that we can get to a just peace with Ukraine. But so far, Trump has found it very difficult to execute a strategy vis-a-vis Ukraine that just kind of makes it all about him and puts his stamp on it, because there's another person with a really big vote in that, named Vladimir Putin, who has frustrated him sort of at every turn. And then in the China case, he thought he would come in with a similar type of swagger and strategy, bring the hammer down with 145% tariffs, and China would react much the way that other countries reacted. And in fact, China and Xi Jinping did not react that way. And to this day, I think President Trump is a little unbalanced in terms of how to approach the U.S.-China relationship, because there's this other big protagonist playing in it. And so I think your characterization is correct. It has its areas where it can take advantage of opportunities. It has other areas where we may get to a good outcome. I'm not predicting the future, but where the challenge is much more acute.
I want to get to China in a little bit, but let's stick with Gaza, but also with Ed's characterization, which was incredibly charitable. I don't know what Ed had for breakfast this morning, but it was a very charitable way in my view, of characterizing the president's approach, which could also be considered erratic, could also be considered narcissistic, it could be considered uninformed on some fronts. And, to go to your point, we were headed in one direction on dealing with this issue in Gaza until it became too hard. And then there was this attack on Qatar, which seemed to have triggered Trump. And all of a sudden, a new pressure was put on. And within a couple of weeks, we got to, okay, there's a hostage deal. And a hostage deal means, in Trump's words to the New York Post on the morning it was announced, an end to 3,000 years of strife in the Middle East. Okay? Well, we've talked to lots of experts in this time. You're an expert. You've talked to experts. I don't know anybody who thinks that, maybe we've done number 1 and number 2 on this 20-point plan, but numbers 3 through 18 range from incredibly difficult to impossible. And that it's very, very unlikely that this is going to turn into a lasting peace. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to get as much as we can out of it. But for the president to say, okay, job done, what's next, also puts us in a difficult position when we know each one of these things is going to require months and years of negotiation and political changes and a whole bunch of other things. I don't know. There was a period of euphoria like 3 or 4 days ago, and it seems to me reality is starting to set in. What's your sense of that, Jake?
You'd be probably better positioned to say whether a sense of reality is set in. I certainly saw the euphoria, particularly in the press reaction to what happened here. I think people do believe that this is likely to lead to something much more fundamental in terms of change in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict still now. And part of that is because, President Trump is masterful at packaging and selling progress, the way that he went to the region, to Israel and to Egypt. Part of it is people are hungry for something good to happen, and the fact that there is right now silent guns in Gaza is a good thing. And then part of it is that it's not just President Trump who can have a short attention span on these things, but the media, who can also move on to the next thing and not worry as much about whether the next set of items gets fulfilled here. I agree with you. It is going to be very difficult. I do think that you have an alignment among the regional actors to try to press for progress on the remaining points of this plan that gives some opportunity to at least move the ball further down the track than we are right now. But there are a hell of a lot of basic obstacles, starting with this fundamental question of whether Hamas will actually disarm. And I think that there are signals right now that that is going to be a huge hurdle, a huge challenge. And my hope is that the president's team, that Steve Witkoff, that Jared Kushner, working with Tony Blair and others, that they're going to stay stuck in on this issue and keep trying to make progress on it.
If I can ask one quick follow-up on that, picking up on a point of yours before perhaps we shifted to China and whatever questions Ed's got. But you mentioned the regional actors. And whereas I'm not sure how much has changed in the views of Netanyahu or Hamas, and in fact, there are reasons to believe that within his party in Israel's right, not much has changed. Within Hamas, not much has changed. It does seem like the regional landscape in the Middle East has changed a lot. Now, part of that is due to Israel picking off Iranian proxies in the region. But part of it is due to the fact that Israel has become kind of an erratic partner of the United States and is seen widely, it's lost a lot of support in the United States, seen widely as an unreliable partner. And that the U.S. is depending more and more on other factors, other forces, other players in the region to play a constructive role. That there's been a kind of a power shift is sort of in the regional politics. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think that's true.
Well, something that passed with, I would say, pretty little mention is that by executive order, the President of the United States extended a security guarantee to Qatar. A security guarantee in quite stark terms, like we will come defend Qatar against attack. Now, question whether that's something that should get advice and consent of the U.S. Senate, and what the real import of that is. But it's an indicator of these really shifting sands in the Middle East and the extent to which the United States is deepening its diplomatic and strategic relationships because it sees other actors as having significant influence in shaping what will happen now that we are, a couple of years on from October 7th. Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, Turkey, the extent to which we are investing in this new leader in Syria and placing some bet that he can actually hold that country together. The historic relationship that we've had with Egypt and Jordan. When you look now at the constellation of actors and how we sit with these countries as partners and think about what is the shape of the modern Middle East and what's it going to take to have a more stable equilibrium going forward. You're right. It's not just a U.S.-Israel conversation, and it's not just us going through the motions with these other countries. They have a real role to play. And of course, the Saudis played this role with France in teeing up this initiative at the UN that the U.S. didn't participate in, which also shows these countries are prepared to act even, without the United States, even in some cases against the wishes of the United States, and so are a very present factor in how we have to think about the shape of the region going.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Ed?
So on China, we clearly, all these issues are important, but I continue to believe, and I think you probably both do, that the US-China relationship is by far the most important factor for the future of the world. And this is, inherently unpredictable and unstable at the moment, and is, because Trump is Trump, likely to continue to be. The phrase weaponized interdependence, popularized by Henry Farrell and Abe Newman, seems to be becoming really live with Trump 2.0's dealings with China. And is it given China's threats, well, not threats, it's issuing of export bans without licenses on all rare earths, and the fact that it has a stranglehold on that, and then Trump's sort of equivalent threats on tariffs and higher access to high-end chips and AI processors, etc. Is it fair to say that, in fact, in this situation, China has more cards than the United States because it takes a long time to build rare earth processing facilities, and China has demonstrated quite a rapid ability to move up the AI and semiconductor curve? Is that a fair characterization?
I wouldn't entirely agree with that, no. So first, on the question of who holds more cards, if I wrote down on a piece of paper the things upon which we rely on China for, and then the things that China relies on us for, I probably just have a longer list numerically on the Chinese side. We have more of our supply chain tied into China than they do into the United States. But if you ask the question, can the United States hold the Chinese economy and Chinese technology at risk just as China can hold U.S. technology and U.S. economy at risk? The answer is yes. There's kind of a mutually assured economic destruction dynamic here. So, their list may be longer, but our list is quite powerful on a number of different factors. Now, specific to your question on chips and rare earths, which are just two items among many that each side could put on the table, I see it a little bit the opposite, which is China is making progress in its domestic chip production capacity, but it is also facing enormous obstacles and is not able to produce at scale and is not able to produce the quality of chip that NVIDIA produces, not even close. And there are real hurdles to it being able to do so that are not just about setting up a processing facility, that are actually about making technological breakthroughs. Whereas with rare earths, the issue is not technological. It's, can we just put the financial and organizational muscle behind standing up that capacity? We have the know-how to be able to do it. Now we just have to do it. And here I will say that, we saw the vulnerability. We took some steps to try to accelerate an alternative supply chain to China on rare earths. I wish we could have done more. I think the Trump administration has taken some steps with this MP materials deal, but they're kind of on a linear curve up this, and we need to go nonlinear now, particularly since China has fired this shot. And I think if we went nonlinear, if we really said this is an absolute crash, Operation Warp Speed thing we got to do, we could do it quite quickly, especially with the rest of the world also now deeply unsettled by the fact that China has not just applied this against the United States, they've applied it globally, meaning that everybody to a certain extent is being held hostage for this critical end.
Yeah, and so that opportunity to forge a common sort of stance with Europe, etc., though, is being completely sort of torpedoed by the fact that Trump has been demoralizing relations with allies.
Yeah, I mean, this is, something I've talked about before. When I was thinking about how we approach China strategy, a critical aspect of it was aligning with allies and partners to collectively de-risk from China. And this would be one of the areas to de-risk. Don't let them have a stranglehold over this critical input. I think what's happening now is you have Europe saying we need to de-risk from the United States, maybe also from China, but certainly from the US. And that makes it much more difficult to build that coalition that I think will be necessary going forward, not just on this issue, but on a range of issues where China represents a real strategic challenge and where the US and Europe working together could actually deal with that much more effectively than the US trying to do it on our own. Unfortunately, we've kind of pushed the Europeans away. And I'll just make one more point here. I think the interesting thing about President Trump, as I perceive it, is that he doesn't see the US-China relationship at all through the lens of geostrategy or geopolitics. He sees it purely in economic terms. And for that reason, he thinks China's a problem economically. Oh, and also Europe's a problem economically. So they're kind of two problems on essentially the same plane, and I need to deal with each of them. And I think that mindset, that kind of typology in the president's brain is standing in the way of our ability to rally like-minded countries into a common strategy to deal with some of these real strategic issues with China, I think to our detriment.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because Xi Jinping, even though this one policy is quite sweeping, has been pretty effective in picking off Europeans on different issues and playing the diplomacy of it. I have a bigger question about China, but I'm going to start it with a smaller question, just because you mentioned earlier something that had gone unnoted by the press. And so let me start with the smaller one, then go to the bigger one. But the smaller one is another thing that went unnoted by the press in the past 2 weeks was that Trump said Taiwan has to move 50% of its chip production capacity to the United States or we're not going to defend them anymore. And which I thought was just an amazing statement, a really out there statement. I was just wondering if you had a reaction to it.
That's a different way to blow up strategic ambiguity. President Biden, of course, tested the limits of strategic ambiguity when he talked about the hypothetical of, coming to Taiwan's defense. President Trump seems to be kind of taking things in another direction. My reaction to that statement was that on its own, it's very eyebrow raising. But I think a lot of people have sort of discounted individual statements. When you put it together with a series of actions, canceling a transit by the Taiwan president, canceling a defense dialogue, postponing an arms sale, all of which have been, publicly reported. Now you begin to see a pattern of clear signals from this administration that they are kind of downgrading the extent to which the U.S. deterrent message vis-a-vis a Chinese attack on Taiwan, they're downgrading that deterrent message. I think this is not good for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And I think Beijing is taking notice of all of this.
Yeah, no doubt. And, they do think a little more strategically than I think this administration is. And I don't know, if I had to place a bet, I would say him taking the tough line with Trump, it may work out better than a lot of other leaders who are sort of cozying up to Trump. Because One interpretation is that U.S.-China relationship is breaking down right now. Another is that this is a negotiation and that Trump wants a deal with China. And he's given a lot of body language that suggests that he wants a deal with China, including a deal that kind of has a wink and a nod, like, we're not going to give you a hard time on the Taiwan. Just let's get a deal. Because I think he sees China as the main prize out there in the world on the economic front, which is the lens, as you said, he sees it through. I know there are other people out there who go, no, things are deteriorating, war is on the horizon. What's your view of the temperature of the relationship right now? And is what we're seeing something long term, or is this in fact part of a negotiation and a kind of a much more tactical?
Well, I think I have to answer that question on two levels. I believe that in the short term, President Trump is looking for a deal with China, as you said, and sees this relationship, as I said, through economic terms. So that deal is basically an economic deal. And by the way, the brackets on the side of that deal are, we're not going to be as concerned about the South China Sea or Chinese support for Russia in the war against Ukraine or even Taiwan. What we want is a deal about trade deficit, investment, these kinds of things. So I think Trump is very focused on that. And I think she recognizes that and also sees some value in the stabilizing effect of a negotiation towards that deal. But I think China is nervous about making it too big a deal because they don't know if it'll stick or not. And so they would probably prefer just piecemeal progress over time. And B, I don't think it changes the underlying competitive dynamics, structural competitive dynamics between the U.S. and China, and that China is going to continue with its longer-term strategy and do so to gain advantage against the United States in technology, with respect to the question of military deterrence, with respect to global diplomacy, and with respect to driving wedges between the U.S. and our allies. A project that, I had a friend who was recently in China who's talking to Chinese scholars, and they were saying, look, we've had a strategy to try to separate you from your allies. You seem to just be doing it for us. So I don't actually think what's happening here tactically in the near term changes the long-term nature of the U.S.-China competition. But I think in the short term, it may lead to pronouncements out of a meeting between Trump and Xi later this month. If Trump goes to China early next year, some more pronouncements. But we should not lose sight of this longer-term trend because I think it remains on pace.
Excellent point. We got about 5 minutes left, so maybe Ed do a brief question, and I'll do a brief question.
I mean, so if at the end of the Biden administration, the beginning of Trump's term, you had a percentage in your head of what's the chance of a U.S.-China conflict in the next 5-10 years, and that number's X, I don't know, let's say it's 25%. What would that number be today?
It's a great question. I'm going to evade putting a precise percentage on it. I'll just say that up front. And my number, I do not think this is inevitable or even likely, because I think there are sufficient steps we can take to deter a dramatic action by China against Taiwan. And in the absence of that, I think direct military conflict between the U.S. and China can be averted. But I do think that the more we send a signal to China that we may not be prepared to play our role in maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, that the U.S. position is shifting in a real way on this, I do think the odds of potential conflict go up. Now, on what time frame, it's hard to say. I think President Trump is mainly focused on trying to avoid it while he's president, probably cares a little less what happens shortly thereafter. But I do think this series of actions has made the issue more acute, and I think that should be of real concern.
So, my final question, you've known me for a long time as somebody who writes about the NSC, and I always thought this was a kind of a, guaranteed me career security because there would always be an NSC. But there doesn't seem to be much of one now. Uh, Marco Rubio is still the acting national security advisor, but Trump doesn't really seem to want advice much. And any comment you've got on that is welcome. But there does seem to be some kind of process brewing out there for national security strategy and a national defense strategy. And inside of what we're hearing is coming there, and inside of what we're seeing, is something that's pretty big, in my view. And that is, what we're hearing is downplaying the China threat, shifting the focus to domestic issues, shifting the focus to our borders, to the threat of drug cartels, something that mimics the allocating of troops, National Guard, into our cities. The sort of a new domestic focus to U.S. national security that, is not like it was during the so-called war on terror. It's something very different. And I was just wondering, as a final point, what your view is on what we're hearing is becoming the formalized national security strategy of the U.S.
I think I am hearing the same thing, from publicly available sources. We are seeing it play out with uses of the military focused on the homeland. We are seeing it play out in comments like what Secretary Bessent recently said on a podcast. He said something along the lines of, we need to take the war on terror methodology and apply it to basically the financing of progressive groups. Now, the link he was trying to make was somehow these groups are financing violence and extremism and so forth. But the import of it is basically a mindset that says all of the tools that got developed across the U.S. national security enterprise for the war on terror are now, in effect, going to start being applied against people in the United States, including this administration's political opponents, including law-abiding U.S. citizens. And I think this is extremely dangerous. And they're not hiding it. They're going out and saying these things. And I think we are likely to see from the National Defense Strategy a similar kind of emphasis and a fusion then of issues related to drug smuggling, immigration, and domestic law enforcement, all adding up to a pretext to act more assertively against people in the United States with the military, with the intelligence community, and with the power of the federal government through, tax enforcement, financial sanctions, etc. This is the direction of travel. And it's not something we need to predict. It's something that is unfolding as we speak. And I think that we need not just people in the opposition party to speak out on this. We need people in the Republican Party to say this is incredibly dangerous.
No doubt. As big a shift as we saw away from traditional policies in the wake of 9/11, a shift that will distract us from bigger geopolitical issues like the ones we've been talking about here, and will weaken us at home and undermine our credibility. I wish we could talk to you for much longer, and perhaps someday in your new capacity we'll be able to coax you back. But for now, Jake, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us. And Ed, I want to thank you for joining in on this conversation, which I think has been extremely illuminating. And for all of you who are listening, please join us on the other podcasts that we've got here at DSR. We've got another one coming out later on our Need to Know podcast as a conversation with Senator Alyssa Slotkin. So I think you'll find that interesting as well. Just follow us at thedsrnetwork.com for more. Until the next time, thank you, Jake. Thank you, Ed. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.